Welcome. Thank you very much for joining this event. I would like to also welcome you all to episode 3 of our How to Series webinar. I'm Adolfo Di Lorenzo, tech evangelist with Portainer. Here's my LinkedIn address and email for those who want to contact me directly. With me, I have also Michael Cooper, our product engineer, also with Portainer for some time now. You're a veteran, aren't you, Michael?
I am now, I guess.
I guess you are. Yes. Thank you. Michael is also here attending these webinars and will be available for you guys to bombard him with all the questions because he definitely has all the answers. I bet you that. So please feel free to ask questions during the webinar in our Q&A box, and we will try to do our best to answer these while I am presenting. And here we have Michael's LinkedIn address and email for you guys to take note and contact us if you would like to have a direct contact with any of us too. So let me start by first of all thanking you very much for this for your participation. This is our episode 3 of our How to Series webinars that we are promoting here at Portainer. The idea is to bring real cases to these webinars of how to use Portainer on your professional, or even if you use this as a personally, in terms of how you can manage your orchestrators, be those Docker or Kubernetes, in your environment, right? And in this episode, we're going to discuss more about the ability to create centralized identity and access management layers with Portainer via our RBAC functionality. So this is more of a business, excuse me, business oriented episode, if you may. So I'm going to work a lot on the RBAC series, RBAC features for you guys to see the huge potential we have with this tool within Portainer versus doing this the traditional way, okay? So by the end of this episode, you should be able to have a good understanding of role-based access control, the authentication options, and also how easy it is to use the authentication options with Portainer. And I'm also going to show logs. I'm not only going to show from a application perspective, but also from a environment management perspective with Portainer. Okay, then. And I'm going to start by just throwing this slide here and talking about the RBAC challenges with Kubernetes today. Let's say you have a Kubernetes cluster, a Kubernetes environment. How do you set up RBAC today? You have to manually configure the roles because Kubernetes does not offer a tool for you to manage roles or granting roles to users. So it's basically something you have to do manually. In meaning you have to write a couple of YAML, if not more, files to be able to just set up the roles. Okay, and for each role you have to have a specific file. So it's complex. The other challenge is the visibility into the user access. Kubernetes does not offer any built-in tool to identify the level of access that each user has in the cluster. Again, a huge challenge because if you don't know what you're doing, you're never going to have like an option with kubectl to understand where your users are, what are they doing, what are their access levels within the cluster. So you have to make sure you know your place, your users, how you place these roles. And if you don't take note of that, it's not easy to just identify that easily within the Kubernetes cluster. And the other thing is the visibility into the cluster configuration. Kubernetes also lacks totally a functionality to help you manage complex RBAC configurations, okay? So with that, I start by saying it's extremely complex to manage RBAC. Today with Kubernetes, you have to make sure you know what you're doing, because otherwise it's a huge challenge, right? And what I'm going to do is going to jump straight into the demos so you guys can see what I'm talking about. And go straight to my Portainer instance. Right. See that you can all see my screen now. Thank you. And again, this is an interactive webinar. Please feel free to throw questions in our Q&A box. Michael is going to do the best he can to answer all these questions as they come up. And just to reinforce that this is an episode where we're going to talk about centralized identity management with Portainer, how we do this with our RBAC feature and authentication and logs. Right. So here I have two endpoints, a Docker endpoint and a Kubernetes endpoint. And I was just now showing how hard it is to do RBAC with Kubernetes, right? Basically, what you have to do is back to my Chrome. You have to start by, you have to start by creating the roles for each user, right? And that's per se a set of YAML files. And for each role, it's a YAML file that you have to set up, right? Then you have to create a service account for each application. So whenever you set up an application, there's a service account for that application. And then you have to be able to manage all those roles with the users, with the application. So next thing you know, you have this huge web of YAML files and configuration files. And we know it's so easy to destroy a Kubernetes cluster if you don't know what you're doing, if you're setting up the wrong configuration by mistake into your cluster, and you might end up blowing it up. How do we do this with Portainer, right? So let's say, okay, let's start with adding a user. I'm going to add user John. And I'm going to give him a password. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create this user. That was easy. Now let's say I have an endpoint here, which is Kubernetes, that I want to allow John to access. So here I have John. And I have already a predefined set of roles that I can assign to John in this Kubernetes environment. I want to give John a standard user role. And I've created access to John. And friends, that's pretty much it. That's all you have to do. Rinse and repeat, rinse and repeat. Basically, you just add users and you assign them roles within your environment. And I'm creating a user called Michael. And for now, the Docker endpoint, I'm going to assign Michael as a standard user. And you might ask, what are these roles, right? Here we have a definition of the roles that we support within Portainer. Why is this important, right? I mean, it's basically what is mostly used and what you would want to have within your Kubernetes, or your better said, your endpoints to manage your orchestrators, right? We have identified these as the most common and the ones that make sense in terms of role assignment to users within Portainer. Creating a user in Portainer is easy. Assigning roles to them is extremely easy versus the endpoint, right? And versus other resources within Portainer. So let me log in as John. So John now is going to log in, and you can see the Kubernetes environment as a user. Oh, sorry, I forgot to set up other config maps. That was my mistake, but I'll fix it soon. And because I didn't assign anything to John, I just gave him the endpoint, but I should have also assigned him other namespaces here, like Ingress and Metal LB, so he can make use of it. So John cannot really deploy anything because he doesn't have access to any namespaces. That was, again, my mistake, and I'll fix this very soon. But here, John, basically what he can do is he can add an application, configurations, volumes, and from a cluster perspective, all he can do is just really just see what's going on in the cluster, get some stats, but he cannot do anything more beyond that. I just created the user. I didn't give him any more any access beyond the endpoint. So I have to obviously give him more options. How would you normally do that again with Kubernetes? I purposely let these errors come up to show that it's not just a matter of creating the user and assigning him the endpoint. You have to also assign them namespaces and other resources within your Kubernetes cluster in order to have a proper access to this environment by a standard user. Again, how would you do this with Kubernetes? By doing the proper assignment of roles and user access to specific applications or namespaces and endpoints within the Kubernetes cluster. That it's probably a set of at least 2 to 3 YAML files after you have to write down and make sure they're properly written in order for them to work. Let me log in as Michael. Michael has access to the Docker environment. Docker does not have all those restrictions that Kubernetes has in terms of assignment. Nevertheless, Michael here is also a standard user, and he won't be able to set up any settings within the Docker environment. He's basically going to be able to add applications from a template list or stacks, but he won't be able to do any admin management within his Docker environment. He can add containers, but if I had 2 or more, let's say if I had to add a container here as Michael, it's going to be a private resource, and if I have a second or third user also accessing this Docker environment, he won't have access to whatever Michael is doing. I can show this very easily, very quickly. And all of these features in terms of a centralized management of your user access and resource access is done very easily within Portainer. So let's go back to our main console and let's fix the access that we gave to John. John needs to access more stuff here. He needs to access the Ingress and Metal LB namespaces. So he can do more than just accessing the environment and pretty much just not just keep looking at it, right? And he also has to have access to a given namespace. So let's say John needs to have access to the PHP MySQL namespace. Okay. Another interesting thing about Portainer in terms of user access is that I can restrict access to the default namespace, which is a security feature. You may ask, why is this important? Because the default namespace, for those who work with Kubernetes, we know that the default namespace is a namespace that has no restrictions in terms of resource assignment. So it can just basically, you can throw any, it can use all the resources. It can conflict with other applications that are in the same default namespaces in terms of resources. So you want to make sure that default namespace is used specifically for the Kubernetes resources. I mean, the cluster, the server resources, then applications, right? So we usually, and this is a business feature, we suggest that you isolate the default namespace so that regular users cannot use this namespace. So let's see what happens if we log in as John now. Okay, John has access to the Kubernetes environment. And now he has access to the proper namespaces. These 2 namespaces I gave access to here with the John profile are namespaces that allow John to use the ingress and the load balancing features of the Kubernetes environment. And I also gave him access to PHP, the PHP my admin namespace I had created earlier. And I can see there's a stack within this namespace. I have an additional namespace that I did not give John access to, which is the DB namespace. And here, if I click on this, let's say John is a DB user, right? Or an administrator. So I can give him access to the PHP dashboard, my admin dashboard, without necessarily having to give him access to the entire database, right? Because I also have a MySQL database running in this Kubernetes cluster. So all of these access that I'm providing to this user are done graphically with Portainer with a matter of, in a matter of seconds, minutes, if you may, where traditionally you would have to write a specific role for this application, for this user, in a service within the applications in order to have them to access this properly. Here, it's just as easy as doing this in one central console. Okay, again, this I have to give access to more daemon sets in this user. Right? And here I have to, here I very easily manage access to resources within my environment to the user John, just by making a centralized management of my users within Portainer. And again, the interesting thing here is that within Portainer, I can manage any set of endpoints. I can do this for any amount of endpoints that I have here within this Portainer instance. Now, let's say that for whatever reason, Michael, let's say Michael here needs to give access, needs to make sure John can access, or better said, let's say John needs to access Michael's Docker environment because he has to help Michael manage a specific feature, right? And I can grant to John here in this Docker environment an endpoint administrator access to Michael's environment. Right. So now, if I log in as John, John now has access to two endpoints. The Kubernetes server where he works as a standard user, and the Docker environment that Michael uses, but now as an admin. And here, as an admin, he has more control over the Docker environment. He can actually perform admin features in the Docker environment that Michael does not have access to. So not only you can manage specific identity and access management within the endpoints, you can do a cross management within the endpoints to all the users you have within Portainer, meaning I'm not limited to that given Kubernetes server environment or that Docker environment. I can expand that and do that across RBAC management with all the endpoints and all the users visually, just by very easily defining them within Portainer. So again, this is a huge feature. If you try to do this manually, you have no idea the trouble that you go through. It's extremely, extremely hard. I want to give a pause. I want to see if anyone has any questions, any comments that you might want to make. Let's see in the chat box if this is clear, how important it is, and how much easier it is to use it to do this with Portainer than with Kubernetes. Any questions so far? Nope. My Q&A, nothing. Good. That is either good or bad, I suppose. Or am I doing a great presentation or I'm not? Hopefully I'm doing a great presentation. So thank you for that. Okay. Same thing with Michael. I could tell Michael here on my endpoint management that he now has access also to the Kubernetes environment. But I'm going to give him another role, not as a standard user, but as a help desk user. Help desk user is pretty much a admin user, but with read-only access. So if I enter here my Portainer instance as Michael, he has access also to the Kubernetes environment. He can see everything. And again, I'm sorry for these issues here. He can see everything, but he cannot, it's read-only. He cannot manage any of the resources, right? He can see all the namespaces. Actually, he can see a namespace here, MySQL, that John cannot see. John only has access to the PHP MyAdmin. Now, look how interesting. You see that although Michael is a admin user with read-only access to this Kubernetes environment, he does not see the default namespace because I restricted that, right? Users won't be able to see the default namespace. So again, doing this with Portainer is extremely easy. And it allows you to very easily and in a safe manner define these identity and access management strategies that you would want to have in your business, just by using a very easy to use graphical interface with industry defined roles that everybody has can relate to. And not only that, here we're talking about endpoints. Let's talk about, let's say, registries. So I can add a registry here. And as you can see, I have several registries I can manage, types of registries we can manage. I'm going to put a custom registry that I use. It's actually mine. And RBAC within Portainer is not limited only to endpoints. You can also perform RBAC with registries. And when it comes to Kubernetes, to namespaces. So for instance, again here, John has access to the PHP MyAdmin namespace. And I can, let's say, Michael that is not going to work on the, let's say I go here to the Kubernetes endpoint and I change Michael's role. I say he's not going to be an endpoint administrator. Again, doing this update manually is a nightmare. I did it in a matter of seconds with a couple of clicks. Okay. Now that, oh, better said, I'm going to now grant him standard user. Let's say standard user update. Okay. Again, I updated this very easily, very fast. Now I'm going to create a specific namespace for Michael. I'm going to call it Michael. Okay. I can limit the resources that I want within this namespace or not, and set several other options, which is not the scope today of this webinar. But what I'm trying to show here is that I can not only in terms of RBAC and IAM manage access to environments, be those Kubernetes and Docker. I can also manage access to specific resources within your Kubernetes environment, right? So now I'm giving Michael access to the namespace called Michael. And when it comes to Docker, you may ask, what can we do? Well, Docker, again, doesn't have this level of complexity that Kubernetes has in terms of access and roles and definitions. But that is not to say that we cannot create, let's say, users, again, that have specific access to specific environments. So let's say again to the Docker environment, I'm going to remove these two guys, and I'm going to add Mary as a standard user of the Docker environment. So again, it was done with a matter of clicks. What does this mean? I'm going to show you again. Mary can perform only some specific actions within the Docker environment that she has access to. I did not give access to the registry, and I'm like, oh my God, mistake. I forgot to give access to this registry to the Mary user. So again, I go there. That's my admin user, registries, manage access, and I'm going to give Mary access to this registry. We don't have the definition of namespaces, the concept of namespaces with Docker, but this doesn't mean that you're limited only to that. You can also use other resource assignments and management via RBAC with Portainer. So now Mary has access to this registry within her Docker environment. Okay, again, I'm going to open to questions. If not, I'm going to start talking about authentication options with Portainer. Right then. Okay, here I'm using the internal encrypted Portainer database. I don't remember, sorry, which exact database technology we're using to store users and definitions within Portainer. I know it's encrypted, but let's say you have an authentication method with your organization, which is, again, I'm using the internal, but you might have LDAP, so you can very easily continue using your authentication LDAP server with Portainer. Same thing goes for if you have Microsoft AD. And as you can see, it's very easy to set up the authentication servers or methods within Portainer, right? It's a graphical interface, be that via custom or an open LDAP server, be that with the Microsoft AD domain, or if you have open authentication, which opens another set of options. Microsoft, if you have the Microsoft open authentication method, Google, GitHub, or even if you have a custom one that you might want to use, right? Now, let's say Google. Just to give you an example, here, when you create a Google authentication access of OpenAuth with Portainer, all you need to have is the client ID and the client secret, right? How would you traditionally do this if you didn't use this method with Portainer? First of all, well, the first step, which is generating the client ID, the client secret, is common to any method. But then when it comes, excuse me, to, for instance, your Kubernetes environment, you have to configure these authentication, open authentication details with this Kubernetes environment. So typically, Minikube has this integration directly with the Google open authentication because it's a Google tool, right? So you have to send a set of parameters to Minikube when you set it up in order to integrate this with open authentication. Then after that, you have to make sure you generate the cluster roles. You add the cluster roles to your Minikube environment. So again, that's at least, I'm sorry, I'm reading another screen. This is where I have my notes, and I see it's at least a couple of YAML files. Then you have to generate the open authentication tokens for each access. And that's another another couple of YAML files, right? So I'm talking about at least four to five YAML files to do this manually if you're using, for instance, Minikube. And it won't be different from another Kubernetes distro. It's usually around that's that amount of YAML files. But then again, you have to make sure they're properly written in order for them to work, right? Whereas here, all I need is the client ID, the client secret, and all that backend of YAML files you would usually have to write is managed by Portainer. And the same thing goes with the other open authentication providers that we have here with enabled with Portainer. So again, if you're a platform manager, engineer, I initially showed RBAC, how easy it is to go back and forth, assign resources, assign endpoints, assign registries, cross-assign users and resources and endpoints within Portainer. Usually it would be much harder to do if with other tools or even manually. Same thing goes here through with authentication. Excuse me, if you already have an authentication method in your organization, this is how you can do it with Portainer. We support the majority of the most well-known and used authentication methods and directories with Portainer, right? Any questions, doubts? My audience is very shy today. What is happening? Michael, what do you think is happening with them? Am I giving an amazing presentation or they're just extremely shy today? Let's see. Oh, some questions. Okay, cool. Thank you. Oh, I see questions are coming up. Ooh, thank you very much. Okay, this is good. This is good. It's still early. Okay, Paul. Yes, yes. For you especially, it is very early. But again, I hope this is being useful for you guys. Finally, another very important feature of Portainer Business Edition is logs, right? So not only we can see, let's say, logs within applications. So I'm going to, for instance, my MySQL database here in my Kubernetes environment, and I can have access to the logs, right, directly within Portainer, which is extremely useful. So I see exactly what's going on. Let's pick another application here. My dash, which is my PHP, my admin. I see logs. Okay, there it is. Portainer also provides within the Portainer instance authentication logs. Okay, this is very important. So let's say I try to join my Portainer instance as Adolfo. Oops. Let's say I try to brute force my entry as John. Or even as Joe, the admin. Right? So now let's see the result of these failed attempts. In my authentication logs, now I see authentication failure and what happened when, who, which IP tried to access the Portainer and what was the status, the result of this attempt. And here we have three failed accesses to this Portainer instance: Adolfo, John, and Joe. So this is a very powerful feature because Portainer is a multi-user platform tool, right? So you want to make sure that you have a good view of everything that is happening in terms of access to this platform, right? Because you typically you might want to have Portainer running on a let's say in a like we're demonstrating here in a centralized or in a dedicated machine, and to that machine you can enable all these resources and functionalities I've just mentioned here, but you have to make sure that they're being properly used by the proper user, right? And not only I can do that via the authentication logs, I can also do that with the activity logs, meaning here I can see what each user is doing within the Portainer instance, right? Um, and this is it's regarding what you do from a pertainer perspective, okay? Not necessarily what you do within the environment, meaning within the Kubernetes or the Docker environment. That has its own separate logs that, as I showed you, you can view via applications and other methods. But here I see when, for instance, a given registry is assigned to a user, right? Or a given endpoint is deleted, and so on and so forth. So not only you have a good view, a log of everything you do in terms of authentication, you also have a log of everything that is done within Portainer, which is also very important because Portainer is, let's say, the gateway to all your orchestration resources within your environment. So it's important to know what is happening within your Portainer instance, right? So my dear friends, this is the webinar of today. I would like to open now for questions and see if this has been useful for you. And I also would like to invite you to, whoever wants to raise their hand and be part of the panel, feel free, please raise your hand, and I'll give you here access to our floor so you can ask questions directly to everyone. I invite you to review this this video later in our YouTube channel. Okay, so let me recap then what we've just seen. I'm going to bring up the slide where we show these three items that we viewed, that we just saw today. Okay, role-based access control, authentication options, and logs. And again, this has been directed to the specifically to those that have the role of managing environments within your organization, usually platform engineers. But try to do this in the traditional way. Try to do RBAC with Kubernetes or even with Docker. Try the authentication options, integrating Microsoft AD or all the open authentication options directly with your environment. And try to have a good view and control of all your logs, be those access logs to your environment or and activity logs of everything that happened within your environment or application logs. You'll see that with Portainer, we've reduced the complexity of these items considerably. And for those who have, or those who manage or have already managed complex environments like I have, and I do also, by having this, you reduce not only your time considerably by having a tool that helps you centralize this in a very easy and concise way. You also reduce the amount of errors that you mistakenly can bring to your environment because you have to generate an X amount of YAML manifests or files to be able to deploy these features and functionalities within your environment, especially RBAC. So with this, I invite you to look up on the internet how you do this traditionally. There are tons of blogs and very well-written articles that show you how to integrate RBAC, authentication options, and log viewing within Docker and Kubernetes. And if you compare all of what you see there with what I've just showed you, you'll go, my God, absolutely, Portainer totally makes sense because it makes my life a lot easier than if I would have to do this in a traditional manner. So let's see how to create a new role. Well, Michael, it depends. What type of role would you need? We have predefined roles within our environment, and these roles have been extensively studied and considered in terms of what the environment allows you to do, especially Kubernetes. And anything other than that would be a combination of the roles we have already predefined within Portainer. So I don't even know if it would make any more sense to create a new role, because it wouldn't go anywhere beyond what we have already predefined. So unless you have something very, very specific, as far as I know, you wouldn't need anything else. So maybe if you want to send me an email, or just and I'll leave here my contact information for you guys to check. If you want to send me an email or connect via LinkedIn with whatever requirements you have, maybe I can check internally how we could do to create a new role. What role would be that, right? So this is my contact information. And here we have Michael Cooper's contact information also, if you would like to ask them. Correct. Well, dear friends, to anyone that to everybody that is here and participating in this webinar, I would like to thank you very much for your participation. I invite you to please fill in the questionnaire we're going to have right after this event, and feel free again to contact me, contact Michael directly with any doubts or questions that you would have, be that via email or via LinkedIn. And with this, I would like to say thank you very much and goodbye to everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone. Thank you very much.